Welcome back to Newsgang. The hashtag is Newsgang on Twitter and on social media. So we're looking forward to your feedback. So we're still discussing the budget tonight. And now we want to get into some of those issues about it. Well, the big one is about our rising debt. Francis, just a quick one, because you always have these numbers of our debt. Where are we at
over
this financial year?
5 trillion shillings.
5.04 trillion?
Or thereabout.
Yeah.
And it is increasing because already you have a deficit of 607 billion shillings in the 2019-2020 budget.
And that is us at 9 p.m. tonight.
Yes. But you see, it could increase because if KRA has a target of 2 trillion shillings and they fail to raise that, it means if we were to properly go with the budget as it is, we will have to look for money elsewhere. So it will keep increasing.
So that's where we are. Mohamed, with our debt, we talked about it, a little earlier in the show. So just reiterate where we are with our debt and why we...
I think we have a debt problem.
Yeah.
And we're not admitting that. Well, when we talk about the budget, we keep on... Treasury talks about revenues, closing loopholes, more tax, revenue side. But we have a serious debt problem, and the national debt has, ballooned. If you look at the deficits, which is the accumulation of the debt, we've been having, 6, 7, 8% deficit. Treasury always projects a very good number, 5.8, 5.6, but we've never done that. If you backtest and look at the numbers, the actual numbers, we're not doing as projected. And for me, I think I'm worried about the debt situation in Kenya. We're already in a hole. We're trying to get out of it. And, the quicker we appreciate we have a debt crisis, the better.
And how do we get out of that debt?
Well, you don't get out of debt.
I was going to ask her because we seem to be digging
deeper.
By getting out of the debt burden by borrowing more.
You don't get out of debt by incurring more debt. So expenditure is getting out of proportions. We are spending more than we are collecting. Expenditure is growing faster than revenue, and what can we do? First of all, you have to appreciate you have a problem. You have a debt problem. Treasury seems to say everything is okay. Treasury said as long as we've not reached 70% of GDP, we're okay. But if you look at the pending bills, for example, that's another hole. It's not in the budget. If you include the pending bills to the deficit which was announced today, if you then also include what Francis said, that we don't meet our revenue target, the shortfall, we will not cut spending. We will borrow.
Very quickly, because I know you want to jump in. This is always the comparison, especially when you speak to Rotich. He says, but if you take a look at our debt to GDP ratio, look at Japan, look at where they are. Now that you are here, just explain to us why. Yes, just explain to us this comparison and why people like yourself say it is apples and oranges.
Japan, US, people always talk about those countries. We are not Japan. We're not a wealthy country. Every country has a tipping point. It depends on, there's someone who did research and said, talking about debt tipping point. For developing countries, it's a different tipping point. Japan is a developed country. It's a wealthy country. It can afford, the debt that I can live with is not the same as the debt that Linus can live with.
Fair enough.
So it's the tipping point for each country is different. Now, also those countries like the US, the dollar is a reserve country, the reserve currency for the whole world. So if the US is borrowing, you cannot say
they're borrowing in dollars.
I'm going to borrow. They're going to borrow, and the currency is used worldwide. It's a reserve currency for the rest of the world. I don't think it, and also GDP, it's only one indicator saying debt as a proportion of GDP. What is important is actual cash flow. Even if your debt to GDP is 40%, but you cannot pay your debts when they're due, you have a problem.
Okay. And I know you want to talk about SGR, seeing as it's now passing
near my home. Before I do that, let me talk about Japan, because it's really unfortunate that as a country, we are so quick to borrow.
Why are you talking about Japan? Have you been there?
No.
You're not in Japan.
I know we're not in Japan.
As Mark Masai once said.
As Mark Masai very properly answered that we are not Japan. And let me start by saying we are not Japan.
Okay.
2, we like borrowing Japanese numbers without borrowing their values. For them to be where they are, they didn't have to do a lot of the things that happen here. In Japan, for example, Henry Rotich would not be finance minister, not after Kimarer Aror questions, and I think I'll come to that later. But back to the points that have been raised by Wehliye here, and I think it's an issue of appreciating where we are. When you're in a hole, why don't you start by saying, hey, we are in trouble. In 1998, when we were covering stories out there, we were in Mombasa for a conference of members of parliament. Mombasa has been a popular destination for a while. And I remember the Speaker of the House at the time was Francis Ole Kaparo. Minister of Finance was Simeon Chaya. Yeah. And Kaparo, in his opening remarks, told them, you know, members of parliament, let's have a very frank discussion. This is a frank engagement between the government, ministers, and backbenchers. Let's have a frank discussion. There were about 80 members of parliament from Kanu, out of about 200 that had attended, about 180 that had attended the event. And Nyachae came and said, the economy is in ICU.
We are broke.
We are broke. He made that admission that we are not doing well, we are in a hole. Now, I think it takes courageous leadership, mature leadership, adult leadership, to sometimes know you are in trouble and you make that admission and then proceed from there to try and fix that. This debt crisis, the way it's being handled, is going to bite us as a country and for a very, very long time. Because the current leadership is eager to paint a clean picture, a very rosy picture of nice things. When you ask about the debt, you are shown SGR, you're told now it's 5 hours to Mombasa. It's not a nice way to answer because it doesn't reduce our debt. We are borrowing to pay debt. We are borrowing to for recurrent expenditure. I think this, even on a normal way we operate in our own families, is improper. So, Henry Rotich will not have the Nyachae moment because I don't think he has the courage to go there. I don't think he has the political weight. You know the difference, unfortunately, Francis. Currently, cabinet secretaries
are technocrats.
All their power is around their allegiance to the president, absolute loyalty. You know, you don't kick Nyachae around because Nyachae
had a political
base, he had a constituency. But Henry Rotich tries some of those games, he'll be on the street around the avenue.
But even then, sorry, the argument that I hear even today Rotich making is that there's nothing wrong with borrowing as long as we are putting that money into the right places and we want to invest in infrastructure development to spur economic growth. But in my opinion, this is where the trouble is, because in the last, let's say 5, 6, 7 years, you've seen quite a number of mega projects coming up quite fast, and probably sometimes even Kenyans lose count of what is being constructed in terms of the so-called mega projects. And when you hear mega projects, to me it also means mega money. And also means mega corruption. So a lot of the borrowing that we are doing is also not necessarily ending in the right places. It is ending in the pockets of our
people. So there's no return on investment on that because a lot of that is being taken up. And I'd like to talk about corruption
before you talk about corruption, Yvonne, I think I'll add to what Churi said. And the economic model that these guys put in place is that public investments will spur economic growth, and then everything else would be good. That has not worked, and they're finding it very difficult to accept that that has not worked and then change course. Now, if you look at contribution of, we've been told that we grew at 6.3% last year, or 6 point something. I'm not sure about the after the decimal, but if you look at that number, you've grown at 6.3. But if you look at your revenues, I don't think we will raise as much as we raised last year. Why? Because public investments don't generate revenues. Now, the contribution of private investment to GDP is almost zero. So if that continues, then you'll have all these rosy numbers of we're growing at 6.3, 6.5%, yet revenues are not growing because government expenditure, you don't generate revenue from it. Now, they have failed to accept that that model is not working. We've invested a lot of money in infrastructure, but on the ground, that is not translating into you know, people being happy, employment, jobs,
money in hand,
nothing. If you go to town, I mean, you see there's nothing, there's virtually nothing, you know, happening. The private sector is dead. People have no jobs, and what is happening is going to lead to, you know, the days when we had the change, the constitution, multi-party. There's another wave coming. And if this government is not serious, and they're basically, you know, painting a rosy picture, the next thing you'll see is people marching, you know, in the streets, demanding for change.
Okay, and change in terms of corruption, because that was the thing I wanted to talk to ask you about, Joe. So perhaps there would have been better return on investment with these loans if the money was actually going to what it was intended for. But that is not the case.
No, even just the good sense of what a government does. You see, in terms of, I think one of the things that have happened with regard to the issue of debt and segueing it to corruption is the fact that initially there was very little transparency about what is being borrowed, what are the terms of payment, how are we paying this, for how long, and then there was the question of what are we doing with it. Remember the many questions that people were raising about the first Eurobond and the CS Treasury said, oh yeah, there were, I don't know, 51 projects or whatever, and it was a back and forth. He said he would table it, he would tell the country what it was and that sort of thing. So on the one hand, there's been this thing of we actually don't really know. We're being told about the major projects.
And then after that, we're told it went into budgetary support.
Exactly. So we got into we got into a situation where the transparency is not there. We are being given terminologies, and yet every time you hear there's a road show out there, we are shopping for more money. So I think in terms of corruption, what happens is that people get angry about every day you wake up, there are all these headlines about billions of shillings having been stolen and everything. And at the same time, what Mohamed is talking about, the pockets of people have holes. You know, when you don't know what's going to happen to you, you've lost your job or you're hungry or whatever. But when you wake up, when you turn on the radio, when you're watching TV, what you're seeing is people stealing. They're not stealing 2 shillings or 1,000 or 1,000,000. Now it is in the billions. It almost looks like it is out of fashion to steal anything that is not
less
in the
than
billions.
$1 billion.
And that is the problem, where corruption has been mainstreamed, that everywhere you turn, corruption looks at you. And I think that, to me, is whether we are borrowing the money, wherever we are getting it, corruption is a problem to begin with. And as long as we are not addressing that, the debt problem will keep getting worse because it's not even bringing in what we thought it would bring. Like Mohamed was saying, like, you know what, this money, you put money here, you invest it so that maybe you build a road and you're hoping that this road will give me better access to the market and whatever, my business will grow bigger and therefore I can employ more people, that sort of thing. It's very simple logic that works if all these things are done properly. But I think we lost it somewhere down the road, and now we borrow so that we can use it to pay other debt or maybe to steal.
And I want to just quickly talk about Big Four as well. This is the president's legacy, and he says, you know, within the next 3 years, you know, he has all of these key pillars. But here's the interesting thing, something as transformative as the Big Four is supposed to be. You know, I'm told that if you're a leader and you announce a new program like this one, for it to be transformative, and you can correct me, Mohamed, is that it would have to have at least 10 to 15% of the budget. So that's about 200 to 300 billion. But for that to happen, this 200 to 300 billion has to come from somewhere else. Have we seen 200 to 300 billion being removed from this project into Big Four? enough to make it, transformative enough? I'm not sure. Let's talk about the one regarding food security in the country. Now, it is known that over 70% of the food that we consume is done by small-scale farmers. Yet, the allocations that are being made here are to large-scale, are to industrial, nothing to sort of help to cushion the small-scale farmers who produce 70% of the food that we eat. I mean, if you take a look at, the budget policies that are talking about large production of staples, and they're talking about, aquaculture and some of those fancy things, which a majority of the small-scale farmers, do not. And for the past 9 years, they have consistently produced over 70% of it. And this is according to the Route to Food initiative. And talking about 10.4 million Kenyans who lack adequate food. Yet, a lot of the allocations that are being done are not even focused on enabling those people to produce the food for this country, for food security, which is the big four.
Did you see that interesting allocation of 7.9 billion shillings to ongoing irrigation projects?
Yes. Considering Galana.
It should remind you of what happened in Galana, Kulalu.
Yes.
And probably, maybe this is an opportunity for our parliamentarians to ask the right questions, because they will have an opportunity to engage with what the Cabinet Secretary presented this afternoon. Now, if you're allocating 7.9 billion shillings to ongoing irrigation projects, then it tells you something. Then there's some other interesting allocations that have been made, something called military modernization. And some hideous figures there, talking about 30 billion or thereabout. A lot of money that is floated around there, but no one really gets to understand what happens to this money. Now, bring in the question of accountability and the auditing of this money. Every so often, when the military team or the Department of Defense goes to the National Assembly for audit questions, it's normally a closed-door session. You will not see an open session. Even the Interior Affairs, you will hear the chairman of the committee say, unfortunately, this will be a closed-door session because of national security issues. No one ever gets to engage clearly with what is happening insofar as these figures are concerned. And maybe because I thought the Constitution gives every Kenyan a right to information, maybe this is an opportunity for our parliamentarians to start asking the right questions, being our representatives and playing the oversight role. Like, for example, why don't we do an audit of all the projects that we have embarked on in the last, let's say, 6-7 years, and see whether we have gotten value for money.
Did the president ask for that, though? When he sort of froze new projects, if I'm not wrong, he'd asked for that.
Well, but did it ever happen? So, instead of keeping on investing mega money into mega projects, why don't we sit back and say, okay, now that we have invested all this mega money in the last number of years, why don't we take it easy, take stock of what has happened, and see whether we have gotten value for money. And therein, we'll be able to hold to account those who are in charge of those resources when they were allocated.
But going back to the Big Four, I think it's a very good, if you look at the Big Four on paper, it looks very good. And unfortunately, it has come at the wrong time. I mean, if the president, when he was elected into office, started with the Big Four and ignored all these mega infrastructure projects, railway and all this, I think this country would be different today, because Wananchi would have felt that more than they get from all these infrastructure projects. But for now, we have no space in the balance sheet for the Big Four. Let's be honest. Wow. And if the president's watching, I'll just tell him, forget about the Big Four completely. And there is no space in the balance sheet for the Big Four. The Big Four requires a lot of money, as Francis
for
said.
50 billion allocated.
Yes.
Now,
so this is interesting. You're saying the president should forget about the Big Four and do what?
Well, focus on trying to stabilize the economy. I think what is coming and what I think is going to happen is there's going to be an economic crisis, which could lead to financial stability, banking system. I mean, we have pending bills. If you look at the NPLs, if you look at the non-performing loans of the banks, it's shooting up every day. Now, the next thing that will happen is a banking crisis. If a banking crisis happens, so the legacy the president should leave is to try and make sure that all the, try and prevent an economic crisis. Try and focus on things like, fighting corruption, try and do everything else he's trying to do. But the big four, you will allocate a few billions here and there the next 3 years, and I don't think none of the you need a lot of money for housing. Okay, they're now relying on PPPs.
Yeah.
Given what's happening in the economy, it's very hard to attract investments to do PPP. Now, if you look at manufacturing, you can't do manufacturing and do whatever the president wants to be done in terms of manufacturing when you're increasing taxes every budget.
So
there is a lot of counterproductive stuff that we're doing that's not going to lead to the success of Big Four. So Big Four, very good ideas, but they came one term too late, and there is no space.
Perhaps they should have started with it.
Pending bills, 400 billion shillings is at the last count. In fact, even the question that I probably thought the National Treasury Cabinet Secretary would address today is how possible it is to implement the presidential directive on Madaraka Day that by 30th of June, all pending bills be paid. 400 billion shillings. Will it be possible?
I am not sure.
We said today we
we're running out of time.
Yes.
But I really want to say something, because economy is my favorite thing. So first, in 2017, Treasury allocated less money to the items concerning Big Four than in the years before. So is Rotich and the President, are they speaking to each other? The Parliamentary Budget Office that we had mentioned before has said this about Big Four, that the Treasury is using disingenuous devices, allocating 76 billion to Big Four drivers and then 356 billion to the so-called enablers. What are these enablers? These are things that government should be doing anyway. And so there's just some things there. And then just finally, perhaps the President can return us to President Kibaki when he left us in 2012 with a primary budget surplus.
Yes, Yvonne, and I just want to add very quickly to what you had to say. And this is my overriding fear, that for the last few years, post-2012, post-2013, there is very little to show that as a country, we've been playing by the normal economic rules. And when former CJ Willie Mutunga called it a bandit economy, he probably was referring to some of these things. These numbers sound good. And Mohamed, I agree with you when it comes to funding the Big Four. How do you do it in the middle of this crisis? I agree with you, Yvonne. What state were we in at the end of the term of President Mwai Kibaki? You given a vehicle that was actually working. Now it's so badly battered. The tires are worn out. The body looks really, really bad. And you know what you're doing? Instead of saying, I'm going to fix it, to restore it, you're promising us a new vehicle.
So we are going to wind up the show, but Mohamed, I'll give you 30 seconds for your last word. If you were President Kibaki, so President Uhuru, sorry, sitting at State House tonight, and you want to at least leave with something in terms of a legacy, what do you start doing between now and 2022? Very briefly. What are the key things, one or two things you must do?
Very briefly, I think it's to stabilize the economy and to prevent, or at least try and mitigate the risks that we face because of a looming debt crisis. And that way, I think what you can do is to look at making sure that we have a plan to reduce debt over the next 5 years, let's say 200 billion every year. That will control expenditure, because it looks like they're not able to control expenditure on their own. I think there are other things that you can do. We have to look at the real
How much development do you do in that time?
In my view, we should do recurrent expenditure, pay our debts, zero development.
Wow.
And that is his memo.
Yes. So you had a memo after all.